195 missed calls. After 5 years of silence, the woman who ordered me to vanish like a ghost was now screaming for a savior through a dead phone line. Bellamy didn't want a husband back. She wanted the man who had built a fortress while she burned her inheritance to the ground. My name is Lachlan, the invisible son who was once a mediocre error in her perfect world, and she's about to realize that some systems don't just reboot, they rewrite the entire reality. The digital pinging of those desperate messages suddenly faded, replaced by the suffocating weight of a memory that tasted like ash and betrayal. The air in the mahogany-clad dining room of the Greenwich Manor was thick, smelling of expensive Cuban cigars and the musty metallic scent of old parchment. Amber light from the heavy crystal chandelier spilled across the table, but it offered no warmth. I stood by the frosted window, watching the late autumn leaves scratch against the glass like restless spirits. In this room full of peacocks, my brothers in their tailored Italian wool and their wives draped in silk, I was merely a shadow. They called me the Invisible One. To my family, I, Lachlan, was the youngest son who had settled for the mediocre stability of systems engineering while they chased headlines and hedge funds. I didn't mind the silence. I had learned long ago that character is like a tree and reputation is like its shadow. The shadow is what people think of you, but the tree is what you actually are. My grandfather, the only man who truly saw the tree, lay in a cemetery 5 miles away, and tonight, his legacy was being carved up like a Sunday roast. Across the table, my wife, Bellamy, sat with a posture that was uncharacteristically rigid. Her eyes weren't on me. They were fixed on the heavy ivory envelope resting near the family attorney's hand. Next to her, my eldest brother, Vance, leaned back with a predatory smirk, swirling a glass of vintage scotch. He led a toast to family prosperity, intentionally tilting his glass away from my direction, excluding me from the circle as if I were a ghost already departed. I stayed calm. I owed it to my grandfather's memory not to descend into the pit of their pettiness. Have you ever stood in a room full of people who share your blood, only to realize you are completely and utterly alone? The family attorney cleared his throat, the sound of tearing paper echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. He began to read. As expected, the bulk of the estate, the property, the investments, the $50 million fund, was left to Bellamy. It was a staggering amount of money, the kind that doesn't just change a life, but reveals the soul beneath it. I reached out to squeeze Bellamy's hand, a gesture of support for the weight she was about to carry. She didn't squeeze back. Her fingers were cold, pulling away as if my touch were a stain on her new silk sleeve. "Wait," Vance interrupted, his voice cutting through the attorney's professional drone. He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his inner pocket. A codicil, he claimed, found in the grandfather's private safe just days ago. The room went still. Vance began to read aloud, his voice dripping with a cruel, rhythmic satisfaction. The document stated that our grandfather had found me, Lachlan, unfit for the family legacy due to a mediocre ambition and a lack of fundamental character. It was a public execution, disguised as a legal reading. I watched the faces around the table. My siblings didn't look away in shame. They leaned in, savoring the dehumanization. But it was Bellamy's reaction that felt like a blade between my ribs. She didn't question the sudden appearance of the document. She didn't defend the man who had worked overtime to pay for her master's degree when we were starting out. She simply smiled, a thin, calculating curve of the lips. "The dead have a way of finally telling the truth, don't they?" she remarked softly, looking at me as if I were a faulty piece of equipment she was finally authorized to discard. As a systems engineer, my eyes are trained to see the flaws in the architecture. From across the table, I noticed a slight, almost imperceptible smudge on the notary seal of Vance's document, a technical inconsistency that screamed forgery. I could have spoken up. I could have demanded a forensic audit, but as I looked at Bellamy's cold, triumphant eyes, a profound realization washed over me. Sometimes, the most expensive thing in the world is a free gift that costs you your soul. If $50 million was the price to see the true nature of the people I loved, perhaps it was a bargain. I stayed silent, not out of weakness, but because I realized the entire system was rigged, and I no longer wanted to be a part of the machine. The tension reached a boiling point when Vance pushed a crystal glass into my hand. The amber liquid sloshed against the rim. "Come on, little brother," he urged, his eyes gleaming with malice. "A toast to Bellamy's freedom and the family's purification. Let's celebrate the will of the dead." The room watched me, waiting for the crack in my armor, waiting for the youngest son to beg or break. I looked at the glass, then up at the oil painting of my grandfather hanging on the far wall. He looked back with the stern kindness I remembered. I didn't drink. I set the glass down on the mahogany table, untouched, a silent boundary that spoke louder than any argument. "Grandfather taught me one thing above all else," I said, my voice steady, carrying a weight that seemed to catch them off guard. "He taught me that wealth isn't what's in your bank account. It's what you can offer the world when the bank is empty." I looked directly at Bellamy, hoping to find a flicker of the woman I married, but there was only a stranger looking back. Bellamy leaned in, her perfume, something expensive and floral, masking the scent of the cigars. She whispered so only I could hear, "I hope you enjoyed the view from the top while it lasted, Lachlan, because starting tomorrow, you don't even exist in my world." It was a declaration of war, wrapped in a velvet tone. In that moment, the house I had helped maintain, the marriage I had nurtured, and the family I had served all turned to ash. I stood up, pushing my chair back without a sound. I didn't ask for a settlement. I didn't ask for a car. I didn't even ask for my coat. I realized that to find peace, you must sometimes let the house burn down just to see the stars clearly. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, my footsteps echoing on the marble floor. None of them called out, none of them looked up. I was leaving $50 million behind, but as I gripped the cold brass handle of the front door, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt light. I felt like a man who had finally stopped carrying someone else's luggage. Have you ever had to walk away from everything you thought you wanted, just to save the one thing you actually needed? I stepped out into the biting Connecticut wind, the heavy doors thudding shut behind me like a gavel on a finished life. The shadow was gone, only the tree remained. I pulled the car into the driveway of the house we had shared for nearly a decade, but the tires on the gravel sounded different now, hollow, like a drum beating for a funeral. The Connecticut night was bone-chilling, and as I looked at the dark windows of the colonial-style home, I realized the warmth had been sucked out of it long before the will was read. I didn't enter as a husband. I entered as a ghost visiting the scene of its own departure. The living room felt sterile, scrubbed clean of any mess or spontaneity. Bellamy was already there, seated at the kitchen island. A single designer pendant light hung above her, casting sharp, clinical shadows across her face. On the marble countertop sat a thick legal folder. She didn't look up when I walked in. She was busy organizing pages with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. It's funny how people start acting like accountants the moment they inherit a fortune. Without a word, she slid 2 documents toward me. One was a no-fault divorce agreement. The other was a non-disclosure and non-disparagement contract. "Sign them tonight, Lachlan," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the melody I once loved. "I need a clean slate to manage the estate. My lawyers say any connection to our previous lifestyle could complicate the branding of the foundation." She didn't even look at me. It was as if she were talking to a vendor who had overstayed his welcome. Then came the ultimatum, the one that truly severed the tether. "You're a ghost of my past poverty, Lachlan. I don't just want a divorce. I want you to vanish. If I see your name in this town, or your face in my social circle, I will use every cent I just inherited to bury you in litigation. I want you to be a shadow that finally fades." I felt a coldness settle in my chest, but it wasn't fear. It was the absolute crushing weight of finality. Have you ever realized that the person you'd take a bullet for is the one pulling the trigger? I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply picked up the pen, the vintage fountain pen my grandfather had given me, and unscrewed the cap. A man's worth is not found in the pockets of those who resent him, but in the peace he finds when he walks away. I signed my name on every line she indicated, waiving every dime, every asset, and every claim to the $50 million. I could see her hand tremble slightly as she took the papers back, perhaps surprised that I wasn't fighting for a piece of the pie. "Wait," she said as I turned to leave. She slid a check for $50,000 toward me. "For your trouble, to get you started, somewhere else." I looked at the check, then back at her. I realized she wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to buy her own conscience so she could sleep at night. I slid the paper back across the marble, my fingers barely touching the surface. "Keep it, Bellamy," I said, my voice quiet but unshakable. "You're going to need it more than I will. Money only magnifies what's already inside a person, and right now, you're becoming someone I don't recognize. I'd rather have my dignity than your charity." I saw a flash of anger in her eyes. followed quickly by a look of profound discomfort. She had expected me to be small. She had expected me to be hungry. But I was already full of a self-respect she couldn't comprehend. I went upstairs and packed my life into a single duffel bag. I didn't take the furniture we picked out together, or the expensive watches she'd bought me to match her image. I took my small toolkit, my laptop, and the old wool scarf my grandfather wore the winter before he died. Under Connecticut law, I was entitled to half of everything in this house, but I left it all behind. I didn't want a single thread that could pull me back into her orbit. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I chose the antidote of total indifference. I walked back downstairs, my bag slung over my shoulder. Bellamy was still at the counter, her glass of wine half empty. She didn't say goodbye, and I didn't offer a parting word. I stepped out into the night, the lock clicking shut behind me with a sound of surgical finality. I sat in my car for a moment, the engine idling. I wasn't crying, I was calculating. As a systems engineer, I knew that a clean reboot required more than just leaving the room. It required erasing the cache. I opened my laptop right there in the driveway. My fingers moved across the keys with a rhythmic efficiency. I didn't just leave Greenwich, I began the process of the digital ghost. I executed a script I'd written months ago, one that de-indexed my personal data, wiped shared cloud accounts, and began the deactivation of every social footprint linked to my Connecticut life. I wasn't hiding from the law. I was ghosting a toxic legacy so thoroughly that I would become a myth in their world. I pulled my old cell phone from my pocket, the one Bellamy had called 1,000 times when she needed me to fix something. I opened the contacts and saw her name, my everything. My thumb hovered over the screen. With a single, cold stroke, I changed the contact to system error. I powered the phone down, removed the SIM card, and snapped it in half. I placed the dead device in the glove box. It was no longer a phone. It was a brick. As I shifted the car into gear, I looked at the house in the rearview mirror one last time. It looked like a museum, beautiful, expensive, and completely dead. The first step to finding a new world is having the courage to lose sight of the old shore. I drove out of Greenwich without screeching my tires or making a scene. I simply drifted out like a fog, silent and untouchable. I didn't know where the road would lead, but for the first time in years, I was the one holding the map. I traded the icy judgment of Connecticut for the suffocating humidity of a Texas summer, arriving in Austin with nothing but a duffel bag and a burning need to be invisible. 6 months have passed since I signed away a $50 million ghost. Now, home is a cramped, dimly lit studio apartment on the edge of the city, where the rhythmic ticking of a cheap plastic clock competes with the constant buzz of a flickering neon sign outside. The air smells of dry heat and old upholstery, a stark contrast to the lemon-polished scent of the manor I once called home. My days are measured in sweat and heavy lifting. I spent 8 hours today as a warehouse loader, moving crates until my back felt like a frayed cable and my hands were so callous they felt like leather gloves. I sat on a milk crate in the middle of my empty room tonight, eating a lukewarm meal of canned beans and bread. There is a specific kind of silence that comes with starting over at 33. It's not empty, it's heavy. But I didn't feel sorry for myself. I remembered what my grandfather used to say. The obstacle in the path becomes the path. Every ache in my muscles was a reminder that I was building something on my own terms now. Even in this abyss, I found ways to give back. I don't go to the local community kitchen because I'm hungry. I go because their inventory system was a catastrophic mess of lost spreadsheets and expired donations. I spent my only day off recalibrating their database for free, sitting on a rickety chair in their back office. "Lachlan, you're a godsend," the director told me, offering a hot meal. I shook my head and smiled. I didn't need the food. I needed the reminder that my value wasn't tied to a Greenwich bank account. My intelligence was still mine, and no divorce decree could take that away. That's where the real rebuilding started. However, the shadow of Connecticut is long, and Vance's reach is longer than I ever imagined. I began applying for high-level systems security positions last month, confident that my credentials would speak for themselves. On paper, I'm a titan of encryption and network architecture. I had 3 interviews at major Austin tech firms. Flawless, or so I thought. The hiring managers looked at me with genuine excitement, promising a follow-up within 24 hours. And then, The silence. Cold, clinical rejections followed every single one. No feedback, no second rounds, just a closed door. I knew something was wrong. I sat down at my laptop, the only high-end piece of equipment I kept, and began to dig. Using my expert coding skills, I ran a deep trace on my own digital background check. I found it buried under 3 layers of third-party verification, a litigation alert, and a character warning. It was a digital poison pill. Vance hadn't just used a forged codicil to steal my inheritance. He had used his old money connections to file a series of frivolous, pending theft of intellectual property claims against me back in Connecticut. In the United States, a pending lawsuit for intellectual property theft is a professional death sentence in the tech industry. No reputable firm will touch a radioactive engineer, regardless of his talent. Vance didn't just want me gone, he wanted me destitute. He wanted to prove that without the family name, I was nothing but a common laborer. It was a systematic sabotage, a viper's strike delivered from 1,500 miles away. Looking back now, I should have seen the depth of his malice. He wasn't just greedy, he was obsessed with my failure. I stared at the screen for a long time, the blue light reflecting in my tired eyes. I felt the familiar heat of anger rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. A man who is a master of himself is a master of his enemies. I didn't call Vance to scream. I didn't call Bellamy to beg her to talk sense into her brother. I simply closed the laptop. If the system was blocked by vipers, I would stop trying to use their gates. I realized I couldn't fight a legal battle against a $50 million estate while living in a studio apartment. I needed to build a fortress where his shadow couldn't reach. I walked down to the Colorado River at sunset, sitting on a weathered park bench as the sky turned a bruised purple. The water was dark and steady, moving with a quiet power that didn't need to shout. They can take your home, your job, and your name, but they cannot take the person you choose to be in the dark. I watched a lone hawk circling above the trees and understood my new mission. I would no longer look for a boss. I would become a ghost that haunts the system from the outside. I made a strategic pivot that night. I began working as an anonymous freelance consultant under the pseudonym Aegis. I started small, local nonprofits, independent legal firms, small businesses that couldn't afford the big security giants. I cleaned their systems, built unbreakable firewalls, and optimized their networks, all while staying completely off the radar. I took my payments in cryptocurrency or through offshore LLCs I set up myself. I was building a reputation as a digital miracle worker, but I remained a shadow. Vance could blacklist Lachlan, but he couldn't stop Aegis. I received an automated email yesterday from Bellamy's new estate office. It was a generic request regarding old tax documents from our time in Greenwich. My finger hovered over the delete key, but I paused. Instead, I forwarded the documents to her attorney with a 2-sentence professional note. No emotion, no personal greeting, no bait taken. I refused to let her drama or Vance's malice take up a single second of my mental energy. I wasn't being kind to her. I was being kind to myself by refusing to engage. I looked at my calloused hands as I walked back to my apartment. They are the hands of a worker, but my mind is the mind of an architect. I realized that my strength doesn't come from a corporate paycheck or a grandfather's will. It comes from the ability to rebuild a world that others tried to destroy. I am no longer the invisible sun crying in the corner. I am a predator in the tall grass, watching the people who think they won. They were too busy spending their stolen fortune to notice the storm gathering in the south. I didn't know it then, but that moment of total isolation was the most important moment of my life. It stripped away the last of my illusions. I stopped waiting for an apology that would never come and started focusing on the person I was becoming. I was building a fortress in the shadows, brick by brick, and the foundation was stronger than anything they had back in Connecticut. The vipers think they have me cornered, but they've forgotten one thing. A cornered man has nothing left to fear. The blue glow of the dual monitors reflected off my glasses, a steady pulse in the otherwise dark Austin incubator. It was past midnight. The air conditioning hummed a lonely tune, and the scent of burnt coffee lingered in the carpeted silence. I was deep inside the back end of a startup's compromised server, tracing a logic bomb that had stumped 3 of their senior devs. I worked as a ghost, an under-the-table specialist hired through back channels because Vance's digital poison still circulated in the bloodstreams of the major firms. I moved through the lines of code with a surgical rhythm. I didn't need my name on the building. I just needed the work to be perfect. True power doesn't need a spotlight, I reminded myself. The sun is silent, but it keeps the whole world from freezing. My grandfather's voice echoed in my mind every time I hit a roadblock. He was a man who appreciated the quiet gears that made the world turn. I found a strange, stoic dignity in being the invisible hand that stabilized the system, while remaining completely unknown to those I saved. Earlier that evening, I noticed a young intern, barely 20, sobbing quietly at her desk near the break room. She had accidentally wiped a directory and was terrified of being fired. I didn't have to help. My own deadline was screaming. But I pulled up a chair and spent 2 hours walking her through the recovery process and teaching her how to encrypt her local backups so it would never happen again. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her eyes wide. "Knowledge is the only thing that grows when you share it," I told her, patting her shoulder. I wasn't just fixing code, I was trying to preserve a bit of the humanity my own family had tried to strip from me. That was the night Adeline truly saw me. I knew she was a respected tech consultant at the hub, sharp-eyed and formidable, but I had always kept my head down around her. She had been watching from the glass-walled conference room as I helped the intern. She didn't see a mediocre husband or a blacklisted engineer. She saw a master. When the intern left, Adeline walked over, her heels clicking with a rhythmic authority on the polished floor. She didn't ask for my resume. She asked me to explain the architecture I was currently building. She figured out the situation faster than I expected. She saw the technical brilliance but recognized the shadow I was hiding in, the legal red tape and the character assassination Vance had orchestrated. Instead of prying into my trauma, she offered a shield. "You're being suppressed, Lachlan," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor. "I don't care why. I care about the work. I'm opening a new LLC called Aegis. You'll be the lead architect. I'll handle the public contracts, the liability, and the corporate face. You stay in the shadows, but you'll have the legal standing of a titan." I hesitated. Trust was a currency I had run out of back in Greenwich. "Why hide?" she asked. I looked at the scrolling green text on my screen and gave her the only truth I had. "Some people use their names to build a throne, Adeline. I'm using my silence to build a fortress. I don't need the world to know who I am, as long as the work is honest." She nodded, a silent agreement passing between us. I agreed to the partnership, but on one condition. 10% of our future profits would go into a foundation for workers wrongfully terminated by corporate harassment. My focus was justice, not the petty revenge my brother lived for. Under Adeline's savvy understanding of U.S. corporate law, we began weaving the Aegis shield. It was high-stakes work, the kind that required absolute precision. While the old money networks in Connecticut were still using archaic systems based on prestige and favors, I was building a security protocol that was light years ahead. It was a quiet power play. I wasn't building Aegis to burn down Bellamy's house or Vance's office. I was building it to prove to myself that my existence mattered. The best revenge is not to be like the one who performed the injury. The momentum shifted rapidly. Within months, Adeline secured our first major contract with a Texas government agency. For the first time in years, I wasn't just a day laborer in a warehouse or a ghost in a co-working space. I was thriving. I was legally protected, my intellectual property secured under the Aegis banner, and my bank account began to reflect the value I had always possessed. I felt the weight of the last 5 years beginning to lift, replaced by the steady, rhythmic hum of success. I realized that freedom is truly what you do with what's been done to you. I stood on the balcony of our new office tonight, looking out at the Austin skyline. The city was a sea of lights, each one a life, a story, a struggle. I pulled the old phone from my pocket, the one I still called the brick. It was still off, cold and silent in my palm. I thought about the 195 calls that were sitting in a server somewhere, waiting for a man who no longer existed. Looking back now, I didn't realize it then, but that moment of choosing to trust Adeline changed the trajectory of my entire life. I felt a strange sense of peace as the warm Texas wind brushed against my face. I had been erased in Connecticut, but I was being written back into existence here, word by word, line by line. I wasn't looking back anymore. I was looking at a horizon that was finally clear. The people who thought they had destroyed me were too busy drowning in their own luxury to notice that the son they rejected had become the architect of a world they could no longer enter. I put the phone back in my pocket and walked inside. The fortress was ready. While my fortress in Austin was rising into the Texas sky, the gold-plated world I had been cast out of in Connecticut was beginning to crack under its own weight. I stood in my office, adjusting the cuff of my charcoal suit, looking at the contrast between my life and the one I left behind. In Greenwich, the lights were brighter, the silk was heavier, but the air was thinning. Have you ever noticed that when people use money to build a wall, they eventually realize they are the only ones left inside? In a sprawling mansion across the coast, Bellamy was hosting another gala. I could almost hear the clinking of crystal and the hushed tones of sycophants flattering her latest philanthropic venture. She was at the peak of her perceived power, draped in couture, trying to buy the respect I had earned through sweat and code. But even from a distance, I could see the exhaustion in her eyes. Beside her stood Vance, leaning in like a court jester with a hidden blade, whispering about a guaranteed real estate empire that required just a few more million in liquidity. I looked at my own reflection in the glass of my Austin headquarters. I didn't feel the need to belittle her. Wealth, I've realized, is the ability to fully experience life. It is not a weapon to diminish others. I sat back down at my desk and picked up a pen. I wasn't signing a divorce decree or a non-disclosure agreement this time. I was signing a profit-sharing contract for every employee at Aegis. Those who helped me build this fortress from the warehouse floor deserve to be protected. Looking back now, that was the moment I truly stepped out of my grandfather's shadow and into my own light. The scene in Connecticut shifted toward the inevitable. Vance, sensing the desperation beneath Bellamy's vanity, presented her with urgent documents. He played on her fear of being average, the same fear she used as a weapon against me 5 years ago. He told her that my anonymous success in Texas was a threat to the family's legacy and that she needed to strike first by securing an offshore investment. He goaded her into a trap of her own making. I watched the digital ripples of their financial movements from my monitor, the data showing a storm she couldn't see. Under the harsh reality of U.S. financial law, Bellamy's signature on those high-risk, non-recourse loan documents was her professional death warrant. Vance had structured the deal with predatory precision. He secured his management fees up front, siphoning off $20 million into accounts I knew he would soon vanish with. Bellamy, blinded by the need to prove she was more than just a lucky heir, carried 100% of the liability. She was signing away the house, the land, and the grandfather's blood-earned fortune. The moment the ink dried, the illusion evaporated. The real estate market Vance had promised was a hollow shell, a classic Connecticut old money scam. Vance didn't stay to offer comfort. He claimed a business trip to Europe was necessary and disappeared before the first bank notice hit her mahogany front door. Vance wasn't a brother to her. He was a predator who had finally found a mark easier than the invisible son he thought I was. I felt a strange, detached pity for her as I watched the system purge her assets. Bellamy, alone in that massive, quiet house, supposedly found a forgotten photograph of me in a kitchen drawer that night. It was an old shot from our first year of marriage, back when we lived on my modest salary and shared a one-bedroom apartment. For the first time, she felt the crushing weight of her choice. She realized too late that you can't build a palace on a foundation of sand and betrayal. The dead had finally told the truth, but it wasn't the truth she wanted to hear. In Austin, the atmosphere was entirely different. Adeline walked into my office, her eyes bright with a fire I recognized. "Lachlan, it's official," she said, setting a file on my desk. "Aegis has been named the primary security provider for the Federal Cybersecurity Initiative." I had become a hidden titan. The boy who was once told he didn't exist in the family world was now the architect of the nation's digital shield. I felt no urge to call Bellamy or Vance to brag. The higher the mountain, the stronger the wind. I knew I had to stay humble, or the wind would take me too. I received a notification later that afternoon about a small charity in Connecticut, a shelter for displaced workers that my grandfather had supported for decades. They were losing their building due to a predatory foreclosure. I didn't hesitate. I authorized Aegis to purchase the property anonymously and lease it back to the charity for $1 a year. My kindness hadn't been hardened by the trauma of being erased. It had been refined. If you've ever rebuilt from nothing, you understand that the only thing worth keeping is the ability to help others do the same. As the sun set over the Texas horizon, casting a golden hue over the city I now helped protect, I stood on my balcony. I pulled the old phone from my desk drawer. It was still a brick, a cold piece of plastic and glass that held the ghosts of 100 insults. But 1,500 miles away, in a house that was no longer hers, Bellamy was picking up her own phone. Her hands were shaking as she dialed the only number she believed could save her from the darkness she had invited in. I didn't realize it then, but the ghost of my past was about to reach out from the dark. I looked at the phone in my hand, then at the bright future Adeline and I were building. The fortress was ready, and its walls were made of something stronger than gold. I'd been a shadow, but now I was the one who controlled the light. I placed the phone back in the drawer and locked it. The recipient no longer lived in the world of her making. The Austin skyline flickered through the floor-to-ceiling glass of my office at Aegis, a grid of cold diamonds scattered across the dark Texas landscape. It was late. The building was empty, the quiet so absolute I could hear the rhythmic hum of the server banks in the next room. I sat at my desk, staring at the small black object in my palm, the old phone, the brick I had carried like a lead weight for 5 years. I finally plugged it into a high-speed charger. I didn't know why I was doing this now, but perhaps the air felt different today, or perhaps the fortress was finally strong enough to withstand the ghosts of Connecticut. The screen flickered to life, the low battery icon giving way to the home screen I hadn't seen since the night I left Greenwich. Then, the assault began. A cascade of notifications flooded the device, a frantic, rhythmic pinging that sounded like a panicked heartbeat in the silence of the room. I watched as the counter climbed. 100. 150. It stopped at 195 missed calls. My thumb hovered over the log, scrolling through the metadata of a life I had abandoned. The voicemails were an evolution of human desperation. I listened to the first few from year 1. Bellamy's voice was arrogant and cold, commanding me to call back to sign minor paperwork she had forgotten. By year 3, the tone had shifted. It was confused, an angry rant about Vance's travels and the rising cost of the house. But the messages from year 5 were different. They were broken, sobbing whispers in the middle of the night, pleading for a man who no longer existed to answer the phone. Silence is not an absence of sound, but the presence of a choice. I didn't ignore her. I simply honored the boundary she drew in blood 5 years ago. Looking back now, that silence was the only honest thing left between us. A notification on my security console interrupted my reflection. Someone had bypassed the first 2 layers of Aegis's lobby security, not with a hack, but with a physical persistence that confused the night guards. I watched the grainy CCTV footage as a weathered man in a tan trench coat waited by the elevator. I recognized the stance. It was the look of a man who spent his life looking into the dark corners of other people's lives. I told the guards to let him up. If the past was knocking, I might as well open the door. Rodriguez, the private investigator, walked into my office with the heavy gait of someone who had seen too much ruin. He didn't look at the expensive art or the high-tech displays. His eyes stayed on me, Lachlan, the man he had spent months hunting across the country. "You're a hard man to find, Mr. Avery," he said, his voice like gravel. "Your ex-wife didn't tell me I'd be looking for a ghost who built a castle." He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened a folder and laid out the harsh reality of Greenwich. Bellamy was no longer a millionaire. She was a casualty. Rodriguez detailed the fallout of Vance's betrayal with a clinical coldness. Vance had leveraged every penny of the grandfather's inheritance into a complex Ponzi scheme disguised as a real estate empire. He had left her with the FBI knocking on her mahogany door while he vanished into Europe with the remaining $20 million. Under U.S. spousal and business liability laws, because they had co-signed the initial investments, Bellamy was now working a retail job at a department store just to pay off the predatory interest on the loans Vance had taken out in her name. "She's being harassed," Rodriguez added, looking out at the Austin lights. "Collection specialists who don't care about the fair debt collection practices. They're following her home, Lachlan. She's living in a 1-bedroom rental above a garage." I felt a strange, detached chill, but I didn't laugh. To watch an enemy suffer is to become their captive, and I had fought too hard for my freedom to let her pain become my entertainment. True freedom is feeling nothing but the desire for justice to take its course. I asked him a single question. "Does she have a safe place to sleep tonight?" It was a lingering piece of my humanity that no betrayal could kill. Rodriguez reached into his pocket and handed me a handwritten letter. The envelope was frayed, the paper inside thin and tear-stained. It was a plea for reconciliation, but not the kind you see in movies. She wasn't asking for my money. She was asking for my protection, realizing 5 years too late that I was the only unbreakable system she had ever known. She wrote about her selfishness, her blindness, and her regret. Have you ever stood in the wreckage of someone else's life and realized you were the only thing they never truly lost until they threw you away? Adeline entered the room then, her presence a calm, steady light that instantly dissipated the shadows of the past. She sensed the weight of the letter in my hand but remained silent, a partner who trusted the man I had become. I looked at the letter, then out at the Texas horizon. I remembered the cold wind in Connecticut and the thud of the oak door that marked the end of my life as a son and a husband. I looked back at Rodriguez and knew what had to be done. I am not the man she left, and she is no longer the woman I loved, I said, my voice carrying the weight of a finished chapter. I wish her peace, but my peace is not hers to take. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. Reconciliation is a contract you sign with the future, and I've already signed a different one. I reached into my desk and pulled out a business card for a top-tier pro bono legal defense firm I funded anonymously. Give her this. They'll help her with the FBI and the debt. They'll find Vance if he's still breathing. I picked up the old phone, the brick, and disconnected it from the charger. The screen went black, the 195 signals disappearing into the void. I handed the dead device to Rodriguez. Help her with the law, but tell her the phone number she's been calling died the day I left Greenwich. The system is purged. Tell her I heard the message, but the recipient no longer exists. I felt a profound sense of closure as he took the phone and nodded. I walked Rodriguez to the elevator in silence. When I returned to my desk, Adeline was waiting. I didn't need to explain. She knew. I had given Bellamy the only thing I had left to offer, a chance at justice, but the man she was looking for was never coming home. I was no longer a shadow or a ghost. I was the architect of my own life, and the past had finally run out of things to say. I sat back down, opened my laptop, and got back to work. The morning sun over Austin was a brutal, uncompromising gold, reflecting off the glass and steel of the Aegis Tower like a beacon of the new world I had built. From my office on the top floor, the city looked like a complex circuit board, humming with a life that I finally understood how to protect. I stood by the window, adjusting my watch, watching a lone, tired figure standing by the glass entrance 40 floors below. It was Bellamy. Even from this height, she looked small and out of place, her shoulders hunched in a faded department store blazer that didn't fit the woman I once knew. My security console flickered with a high-tech interface, her face scanned and instantly flagged in red. Restricted, do not enter. The system was doing exactly what I had designed it to do. It was keeping the past out. But as I watched her, I realized that the best way to avenge yourself is to be unlike the one who performed the injury. I wasn't preparing for a confrontation. I was preparing for the final funeral of a memory. I pressed the manual override, watching the red text turn to a steady green. Let her up, I told my assistant. And please, bring her a hot tea. She looks cold. The heavy glass doors of the executive suite hissed open 10 minutes later. Bellamy stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took in the soaring ceilings, the awards for innovation, and the quiet, rhythmic power of the headquarters. She stood there, frozen, realizing that the mediocre youngest son she had discarded 5 years ago was now a titan. The silence in the room was deafening, a vacuum that sucked the air out of her lungs. Looking back now, I didn't feel the triumph I expected. I only felt a profound, quiet peace. Bellamy broke first, her voice a thin, cracked whisper that barely reached me across the mahogany desk. She admitted everything, the way Vance had manipulated her, the theft of the grandfather's legacy, and the 195 calls she had made into the void of my old life. She tried to use the word love, but in this room it sounded like a hollow echo, a currency that had been devalued to zero long ago. I threw away a diamond for a handful of glass, Lachlan, she sobbed, her hands trembling. I was blind. I was so incredibly blind. I remained behind my desk, not out of arrogance, but to maintain the boundary I had spent 5 years fortifying. Bellamy, you didn't make a mistake in the heat of the moment, I said, my voice calm and steady. You made a calculated decision based on what you thought I was worth. I've spent the last 5 years becoming the man who no longer needs your validation or your apology. I looked at her, truly looking at her, and realized that the woman I loved had died the night the will was read. This was just a stranger mourning a fortune she didn't deserve. Despite everything, I didn't want to see her destroyed by Vance's shadow. I pushed a folder toward her, containing the retainer for a top-tier legal defense team. I have already paid for your lawyers, Bellamy. They will fight Vance's fraudulent debts and handle the FBI. I'm helping you because it is the right thing to do, not because I want you back. My mercy is for your survival, but my heart is reserved for my future. I watched the realization hit her, that my kindness was the ultimate closure. It was the sign that I had moved beyond the reach of her influence. The door opened behind her, and Adeline walked in, still breathing hard from her morning run, her face flushed with health and life. She didn't say a word, but the way she walked to my side and took my hand told the whole story. It was a public declaration of a genuine partnership, a life built on mutual respect rather than economic necessity. Bellamy looked at our joined hands and then at Adeline, seeing the future I had chosen. The system hadn't just been updated, the old user had been completely and permanently deleted. I hope you find the peace you're looking for, Bellamy, I said, the finality of my words settling over the room like a soft dust. But you need to find it somewhere I don't exist. Please, don't come back to this office, and don't call the old number again. The recipient is gone. She nodded through her tears, finally understanding that some doors, once closed, can never be unlocked again. She turned and walked out, her footsteps fading into the thick carpet of the lobby. I watched from the window as she walked out into the Texas heat, a small rental car pulling away from the curb and disappearing into the Austin traffic. My grandfather was right. Life isn't about the fortune you inherit, but the character you forge in the fire of betrayal. I had moved from being a system error in my own family to becoming a master architect of my own destiny. The youngest son had finally found his voice, and it was a voice that spoke of strength, not spite. I walked out onto the rooftop garden with Adeline, the warm wind brushing against our faces as we looked toward the horizon. The Texas sun was bright and clear, illuminating a path that was entirely ours. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the old phone, the brick, and looked at it one last time. I pressed the power button, watched the screen go dark for the last time, and felt the final tether snap. I wasn't just surviving the system anymore. I was the one who designed the world I wanted to live in. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do isn't fighting back. It's moving on so completely that their shadow can no longer reach you. True wealth is never found in a bank account, but in the quiet strength to walk away with your dignity intact. I chose to build a new world rather than haunt an old one, and that was the only victory that ever mattered. But what about you? Have you ever had to choose your own peace over a toxic history? I'd really value hearing your thoughts and experiences in the comments below.